I'll forever be repeating that I am a harsh judge. Not only am I a harsh judge, but I utilize the full range of scoring. For example, for me, 4 out of 10 and 3 out of 10, also 2 out of 10 and 1 out of 10 are different scores. They don't all broadly mean flat-out failure. 0 out of 10 is flat-out failure. 1 out of 10 would be a story that I couldn't finish and have never wanted to return to. 2 out of 10 would be something that I'd never want to experience again, etc. If you ever experience one of my reviews, don't be shocked if a manga you think is perfect, I rank as 75% or lower. To be clear, I'd for the most part argue that anything above 5.5 out of 10 is good in some shape or form. Today, we'll be reviewing One Piece. This is to top off my crazy theories over the last several weeks and put a little pin on that for now. I'm a pretty analytical person, so I have several categories in which I will break down this and any other future review. Keep in mind that everything discussed here is subjective and the weights themselves are entirely biased. As objective as I'd like to claim to be, I don't think anyone would actually be able to match that description. Without further ado, let's jump into it. One Piece wa Jitsu Sai Suru. The plot. One Piece gets a 12 out of 15, because while it's definitely on track for an end goal, Oda has set his story up in just such a way that there could be 6 islands between the start and finish, or 600. As such, while everywhere has been important to the plot, there are still times where I feel we're getting lost in the weeds. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, you can certainly feel it. Dressrosa legged on. At the time that it was being written, Fairy Tail was having its own tournament arc. This tournament was widely negatively received by fans. It felt like a colossal waste of everyone's time. And then, when Oda made his arena arc within Dressrosa, it was obvious that he was writing in a certain way to almost show Hiro Mashima how to do a tournament properly. This isn't just a me thing. Go find any YouTuber like For Neverworld or King of Lightning or others that were around back then, and they all say the same thing. It wasn't subtle, and it pulled away from the focus of the plot. There are also various complexities and mysteries within One Piece that make it very challenging for the reader to sometimes keep track of everything. If there's a red herring or a dead end somewhere along the line, we have no idea because there are so many different plots to follow. This is both a strength and a weakness. However, it's still very strong on the whole. Even though there are storylines exclusive to the island they are on, they all read wonderfully. Specific arcs like Arabasta and Marineford and Enies Lobby are masterclasses of how to properly formulate and implement a story. Heck, even Fishman Island, which at the time felt hella annoying, was, on a second and third pass, incredibly well done. When you don't have to wait for weekly releases and can read at your own pace, One Piece only appreciates in value. Art. Just like every category that I have, art is subjective. When I first started reading manga, the most popular at the time were the big 3. This would have been in 2005-ish. Naruto was still a baby anime. I found Naruto's art to be quite pleasing, and I'd seen the most recent episode that intrigued me so, The Forest of Chakra. Then I read Bleach because it was also pleasing to the eye, and let's face it, Dragon Ball with swords. When I caught up on that manga, I still didn't go to One Piece right away. In fact, I read Inuyasha next because I loved the anime at the time and figured I was on a roll with manga, so continued that trend. No, I avoided One Piece and Fairy Tail both for so long because I thought the art was terrible. It really didn't sit well with me. I didn't want to be constantly distracted by the bad art, so I put it off for a long time. This is probably 2006 or 2007 now, and I must emphasize, I didn't know much about manga at all. My only knowledge came from the website that I used at the time and the anime that was available to me on TV. I lived in a small town. We only got 7 channels, and only one of those was for kids. My anime consumption at the time was super strict as a result, and I just didn't know much. As a result, when I saw Fairy Tail and One Piece next to each other on this website, I assumed they were written by the same person because their art in the earlier days was extremely similar. So I read Fairy Tail, got a couple volumes deep, and realized very quickly how repetitive the plot was and gave up on it. This also hurt my entry into One Piece, but eventually I tried it out, and the difference between it and Fairy Tail was obvious from day one. However, it would take me a solid 150 chapters before I got used to the art. It was really hard to get used to. And again, eventually I grew to like it, and to this day I think it's wonderfully creative and I love the art. The reason I gave you a history lesson here is because this wasn't just a me problem. At the time, I was getting more and more into manga, so I was suggesting some stories to friends. I managed to easily rope everyone into watching Dragon Ball Z with me. But then, I had a more narrow group of friends who had continued interest in other anime and manga. So I showed them the same picture that I saw, a wide shot of the big 3. Just like me, they had remarked that the art for One Piece was odd, and some chose Naruto to check out next, while others chose Bleach. Again, while I think that now all the art is great, it took a long time for it to grow on me. So that does hurt this score, as I've experienced personally and actually observed others saying no strictly because of the art. If its score was based on just that, I'd have ranked it much lower. I'm a harsh judge. However, there are other phenomenal strengths that Oda employs throughout all of his chapters. Yoshihiro Togashi, the mangaka of Hunter x Hunter, has had a tumultuous run. At the very start of the Chimera Ant arc, fans of this story will remember a couple chapters that look like utter garbage, because Togashi couldn't be asked to do the work properly. Now, his work conditions were far from good, but it was his job nonetheless, his apparent passion, and he decided not to do it well. Oda, on the other hand, has shown time and time again, chapter after chapter, to pour his heart and soul into every single page that he draws, and it shows brilliantly. There's rarely white backgrounds, except for when they're on purpose to add weight to a panel. Wide shots of cities or islands are ultra detailed. He's either a speed artist or he's been working 20-hour days, because these pages look absolutely phenomenal. If I rated Oda's art based solely on this later art, it would certainly get a much higher grade. Characters. This one is easy. I can barely think of a single character that I don't love or am interested in, and One Piece has hundreds of characters. Not shocking at all, the characters that I don't care about much didn't get much time to shine. For example, Gaimon shows up for one chapter at the very start of the story. He's stuck in a chest, and the very next chapter we proceed to never see him again, except perhaps in cover stories. It's characters like these that I am uninterested in. But I don't hate him. In fact, most of the villains of the story I also don't hate. That can definitely be a good and a bad thing. You generally want your villains to be hated. Joffrey Baratheon is a glorious example of a villain that everyone hates. But Game of Thrones is a much darker story than One Piece, so it's not necessarily expected that One Piece should have any character that we love to hate. There are antagonists such as Blackbeard or Akainu or King Emu that are mysterious, intimidating, or flat-out mesmerizing, but I struggle to find people who actively hate these characters. It's more of an intrigue than dislike. And for the characters that we all love, that love is transcendental, and it blows my mind just how much I care about the characters. Senor Pink is a bad guy. We shouldn't be drawn to tears for any story he has. But I've watched people weep at the reveal of his backstory. I felt the starvation of Zeth. I've known the helplessness of Nami. I admire the determination of Zoro. I love the courage of Luffy. I'm mystified by the mystery of Shanks. When I think about Naruto, I think about how much I like Naruto. Sasuke is kind of annoying and Sakura's useless. I only actively like half of Team 7, Kakashi being the second. These are main characters. I shouldn't have any hesitation or disappointment in the main characters of any story. Yet I am in Naruto. But in One Piece, I actively want all the characters to succeed. Not just the main crew, but the revolutionaries as well. I want Shanks' crew to continue to prosper. I want Buggy to find his way to the top. I even want Blackbeard to find his dream fulfilled. It's a crazy feeling. When someone writes a story, it's either in first or third person perspective, normally. And thus, the reader experiences the story from first or third perspective. There are weird niche books that exist in the world that are omniscient points of view. These are stories told from the perspective of God. Well, One Piece isn't written like this, but it's certainly read like this. The reader, like a god that cannot intervene, knows way more than any singular character in the story. The reason this is important to me when it comes to appreciating characters is that Shanks wants to see Luffy again. But Luffy doesn't necessarily know that. He might not care, but he doesn't know that Shanks wants to see him again. But we do. Every time Luffy's name is mentioned, Shanks gets excited, like hearing about a long-lost friend. So this is just one droplet in the ocean that is complexities between characters that we as an audience get both sides of. It's genuinely awesome for me, a real cathartic experience, to see Garp or Dragon or Shanks reminisce or long for a meeting with Luffy. Or to see just how far the crew has come in their own unique journeys to their ultimate goals. Pacing. This one was hard. It's hard because One Piece has several arcs that are picture perfect when it comes to pacing. So well done these arcs were that I couldn't ever hope to come up with a better way to pace them without sacrificing something brilliant. I've listed some of them already, but Drum Island, Arabasta, Enies Lobby, Impel Down, Marineford, Fishman Island, and even Whole Cake Island were, in my honest opinion, perfect. Just perfect. Of course, I read almost all of the arcs live. When I first started reading One Piece, it was 2007. The Drum Island arc was just finishing. Yeah, I've been reading it one chapter per week since Drum Island. However, for every perfect arc, I also have arcs that annoy me. Pre-Lowtown was easy and fast, but short and simple. Skypiea, Thriller Bark, Punk Hazard, Dressrosa, and Wano were, in my opinion, way too long. Punk Hazard wasn't long chapter-wise, I've never been able to fully enjoy every chapter of that arc. I like the pervy gimmicks of Sanji stuck in Nami's body or Smoker swapped with Tashigi, and while I thought these bits were hilarious, the tension of the villain Caesar Clown just never lands for me. He's too much of an idiot for me to ever take him seriously. I know a parallel could be drawn somewhere here with Buggy the Clown, but knowing Buggy's history and apparent power, I can forgive his goofiness. Pacing is bad when you read a chapter and are left with just meh feelings. And fortunately, that rarely happens in One Piece. There's always something happening to keep you hooked in regardless of where in the story you're at. Paneling. Whether I'm reading chapter 1058, 658, or 258, I've never had trouble with what order the paneling is in, or confusing speech bubble order, or when a history lesson starts or finishes. While Oda isn't necessarily a paneling genius, he certainly isn't a fool either. If you wanted an example of what I'd consider perfect paneling, I'd draw your attention to Magi Labyrinth of Magic. Specific examples would be chapter 342, where Shinobu Otaka takes her time with an entire page to make true art. It's almost as if she's challenged herself in a one-person bout of one-upmanship. Throughout her story, paneling just gets better and better until it reaches a true apex. This category receives less weight, not because paneling isn't important, but because I can generally enjoy a manga regardless of how well its paneling has been designed. Great paneling can enhance the experience, but for me, terrible paneling doesn't necessarily hurt the experience. I recognize that for a comic artist, this would certainly be given much more weight, as paneling is essentially the foundational backdrop to telling your story properly. Forethought. Forethought is whether a story or its events are pre-planned. Is the mangaka or author shooting from the hip on their decision making, or have they had their story planned for years or even decades? We know Oda's had One Piece planned for decades, and it shows. There's foreshadowing that doesn't see fruition for hundreds of chapters, and yet we see their fruition. Some things are forgotten, but for a story as monstrous in size and scope as One Piece, can we hardly fault the guy? One thing Oda's infamous for forgetting is how many moves are in Luffy's repertoire. We'll often see Luffy use a named ability once and then never again. It's not because Oda thought it was a bad move, it's usually because he forgets about it completely. I don't think forethought is required to make a story good, but it certainly enhances it. Like paneling, I weigh this as less important than other categories, but still important enough to warrant a category at all. D. Greyman didn't have much forethought. Though this is never implicitly stated because its multiple breaks have been apparently due to Katsura Hoshino's poor health, every time a hiatus has ended, the story starts back up in a very disjointed manner, as if she's forgotten where she is. And unfortunately, though a phenomenal manga to start with, the way she can't smoothly return kills everything, and makes it pretty clear to me that there's simply not enough planning or forethought. Immersion. So I'm kind of a weird dude. I don't have the critical eye for movies my brother or friends seem to have. As such, I can sit down and watch most movies, good or bad, and lose myself in them. And I mean, except for the very worst of movies, I don't ever have a problem just enjoying what's on the screen. Twilight, for example. I thought the books were like 4 out of 10, but the first movie is one of my favorite guilty pleasure movies. I only call it a guilty pleasure because it's panned by all, but I legitimately love the directing style and cinematography in that movie. Like, really. The rest of the Twilight movies be damned, I just like the first one, if there's any kind of redemption I could claim. However, reading is different. It's strictly a visual experience. And when I started reading Naruto, my first ever manga, I had a lot of trouble sitting there in a silent room reading a visual medium. So what I've ended up doing is attaching songs to manga that I read. For example, Vengeance on the World from Final Fantasy's Crisis Core game is a song that I legitimately play on loop whenever a new One Piece chapter releases. I've listened to that song so much while reading One Piece that I actually no longer associate it with Final Fantasy VII or Sephiroth at all. For me, it's now the One Piece manga song. It's kind of funny how the brain works sometimes. But anyway, with the help of music, I fall right into the pages of a manga as if they were water, and One Piece is awesome for this. I would cite my theories as proof of the investment I have in the history, characters, and ongoing plot in the world of One Piece. I often daydream about what form I'd take in this world, if it were made into some sort of MMORPG where you could choose a faction, like the Navy or Pirate or Revolutionary, etc., and then you'd get a quest for a devil fruit or some sort of hockey, and what kind of devil fruit would I possibly have, etc. And quite honestly, I don't daydream like this with every series I read. That's a staunch testament to how strong I feel the pull from One Piece. Length. Length is very important and almost goes hand in hand with pacing. When I sit down and read Full Metal Alchemist, I know that I can finish the entire thing in a week if I feel so inclined, and I don't feel robbed or shortchanged at the end. I'm left feeling satisfied. I mean, let's face it, Hiromu Arakawa made one of the best manga of all time, especially in terms of length and pacing. But that doesn't mean having barely over 100 chapters is the perfect length. Fullmetal Alchemist wasn't an epic meant to be of such global scope. It was a confined and refined story that had an intentional, precise, local start and end. One Piece is a modern epic. Like every other awesome epic of the last 100 years, it's really long. That comes part and parcel with the genre it has chosen to be. However, while a manga can be too short and not deliver on most of its promises, a manga can also be too long and take too much time to deliver on its promises. There's a very good reason why I stopped reading Hajime no Ippo. I only got to about chapter 350 before I realized that it was just being extended forever for the sake of extending it. Don't get me wrong, having a shy, introverted character go around conquering his fears and having classic boxing matches is great, but not great enough for me to endure 1400 plus chapters of it. There's only so many times I can see the same arc before it clicks that it's the same thing with minor details rehashed. One Piece is, for me, almost too long. I'm stuck in this limbo where I both want it to end so I can finally see all the mysteries revealed, and I want it to go on for much longer because the experience is awesome. However, because I do feel like pacing in the past has been poor, I can't very well give length a perfect score either. Depth. Is One Piece complex? Do I discover something new every time I reread it? Absolutely yes to both. I've reread One Piece probably around a dozen times in my life, and of course, each successive time I reread it and it just gets harder and longer, but that's beside the point. My favorite analogy is when someone once tried to describe Skyrim to me. They called it an ocean that was an inch deep, and wished that it was more like Deus Ex Human Revolution, which is far shorter but far more complex. A puddle that's a mile deep in comparison. If I were to utilize this analogy for manga terms, I would say that One Piece is an ocean that's also a mile deep. A contrasting example to this would be Seven Deadly Sins. That manga has absolutely zero depth to it. Every character is one-dimensional. There's no nuance. And when I quit reading it for the first time, I eventually caved, came back to reread to give it a second chance, and I was extraordinarily bored because I wasn't learning anything new. I thought I'd have to restart to refresh myself, but I realized that it's such a simple story that there was nothing to forget. That was a manga that, for me, was an inch-deep puddle. No substance at all. So on my subjective ladder of ranks, if SDS is a 1 out of 10, then One Piece, its exact opposite, would have to be a 9 out of 10. I haven't given comprehensive thought to SDS though, so don't throw me to the wolves. I'm just trying to think of other manga to compare for these categories. It's also nice to have a fully fleshed out world within which the author can dabble. When a story talks about far-off lands or countries but doesn't have a map for reference, for example, it just comes across as lazy. Pilot. A pilot should be strong enough to pull your interest. This makes sense, but very rarely do we catch a manga from day one. We're often able to binge a newly discovered manga, making it difficult to truly ascertain the value of a pilot. The question is, can you read a pilot chapter and return a week later remembering what happened, what parts of it were interesting to you, what the characters' names were, etc.? As I stated in the art chapter, it took a lot of swinging back and forth before I truly started One Piece in earnest. In my case, I read the first chapter and walked away for a few weeks before returning. I couldn't remember anything, but upon second reading, I certainly found it much more rich than the first time. I liked the setup, the characters, and Luffy in particular. A poorly thought out chapter that I can think of would be Needless by Imai Kami. In this pilot chapter, you're shown a few pages of sex appeal, and then thrown into 40 pages of ultra-complex story and heavy dialogue. It was extremely repelling to me when I initially read it years ago. Just like One Piece, I eventually returned to it and thankfully kept reading because I think Needless is one of the most accidentally funny manga I've ever read. But should a story have a weak enough pilot but even a phenomenal story, it risks losing additional readers. Genre faith. If I think about a story like Horimiya, one of the few romance manga I've read, I remember that the story doesn't just go on forever with unrequited love. A romance isn't just about two characters who flirt for the story's duration. It's about the characters being together, and sometimes even marrying before the story's end. That's a successful romance to me. If, on the other hand, I read a story that's 150 chapters long, and the characters don't get together until chapter 149, I think I've been cheated all the way up to that point. Unrequited, endless flirtation has got to be some sort of psychological torture. Meanwhile, if a manga is labeled as horror, but it doesn't scare me or make me feel paranoid, then it's not a horror. It's failed in its mission statement. Shonen are easy. All you need is action and adventure, and One Piece has this in spades. One Piece is also a fantasy and a romance. It hits on fantasy very strong as well. Have you ever wondered why the story's original name is Romance Dawn? Well, time for a small history lesson. Romance is likened to love stories thanks to Jane Austen, coining a second definition for the term. However, the original definition of romance is basically an adventure wherein the focus is on a quest, an adventure that involves bravery, mystery, and strong values. Think knight in shining armor rescuing a princess from a dragon. That is a romance. Well, isn't that funny? One Piece hits the nail on the head. Even if you wanted to twist the modern definition to fit the story, you could still just say that the Romance Dawn is Luffy's journey of love. But he doesn't love someone, he loves the adventure itself. Well, it seems we've reached the end. Tallying the scores together lands us at 84.5 out of 100. On my scale of letter grades, that's an A. Well, alright, there's very little to complain about on that side of things, I think. A 100 out of 100 would be an S if you're left wondering about the last 15 points in letter grade. Gotta have an S if I'm judging Japanese manga. Also a reminder, F is 0 out of 100, so the letter grades stretch across larger windows of scoring. Anyway, I guess in conclusion, I would almost recommend this story to anybody. The only reason this is an almost is because One Piece has for some reason not translated well with Western audiences. Dragon Ball hit the world like a storm because of its high-octane fighting. Naruto accomplished the same because everyone loves ninjas. You'd think One Piece would have some traction because of Pirates of the Caribbean, but clearly something hasn't panned out along the way. In a world of increasing anime watchers, One Piece also struggles with time. The anime is extremely old-fashioned for the first 700-ish episodes, preferring to be a carbon copy of the manga. While it's great to be true to the source material, the anime wasn't taking advantage of its medium. Of course, recent episodes are stunning pieces of work, but you can't expect someone to sit down and watch hundreds of terrible episodes with the promise that it'll get good eventually. By the way, you're free to love the anime. I'm just saying that if someone sits down and watches My Hero Academia or One Punch Man, they'll hardly have any interest in downgrading anime quality to watch something that's clearly 20 years old. However, on the manga side of things, I don't see that age so clearly. Current chapters are ultra crisp, and though I don't know for certain, it definitely makes me think he's swapped to digital drawing from analog because of just how sharp and clean everything looks these days. But that could be other areas of advancing technology as well. I hope you enjoyed at least some of this review. Stay tuned for next week where I plan to expand further on the Sakura rewrite I'm still working on. If there are any other manga you'd want me to review, let me know. I also have different categories for anime. Evidently, I can't judge an anime based on its paneling. That simply doesn't make any sense. Regardless, the sky's the limit.